P. Wolf, everybody. How lucky are we that we got to see the first half of this incredible film in this space, in this theater, at MOMA. What an amazing gift, and to get to speak about it. I'm going to try to be really formal with you, even though we speak on the phone every day, and just like kind of really put it to you straight. Like, yeah. So I wanted to start by asking you, you've always had a very interesting relationship to fandom. You are a fierce fan of many things. My So-Called Life. You've made films about some of them. You were the person at age 15 to start a petition to try to bring My So-Called Life back on the air. You were unsuccessful, but...
Bar mitzvah speech.
Your bar mitzvah speech was also about My So-Called Life?
Uh-huh.
That's so moving. You were obviously a huge fan of Arthur Russell, who you made your first film about. You have had fascinating, and I would say up until those point, very niche fandoms. Paul, Pee-wee, is probably the most public person that you've been interested in profiling, and yet at the same time, the person who it's the hardest to access information about. And so I wanted to ask you about your relationship with Pee-wee, with the idea of Pee-wee up till making the film, and then what it was like when you ultimately encountered Paul.
Thank you. My relationship to fandom is that if there's something I'm kind of obsessed with, I don't want to leave it to the realm of appreciation. I want to actually make it part of my life experience, hence, documentaries. And, I go into all my subjects with a lot of affection, but I don't do the hero worship so much. And so I grew up, Pee-wee's Playhouse is part of my DNA. It definitely shaped who I am. I would say it's the first art I had an emotional connection to, and that's the kind of art that I aspire to make. And I didn't know anything about Paul beyond just very limited stuff, but I had the sense intuitively that he fit into my wheelhouse, kind of unconventional visionaries who are ripe for reappraisal. And I approached Paul, who had been approached many times, really with that line, I want to do a portrait of an artist. I want to really look at the constellation of cultural references and life experiences that collided into this character, but also I'm interested in the distinct separation you made between yourself and your alter ego. And I guess that appealed to him. But with a lot of reservations and resistance, because Paul, although he wanted to do a documentary, was very ambivalent about being known as himself. So we engaged in, at times, a fraught, but also thrilling adventure to suss that out, to allow Paul to integrate himself with Pee-wee for the first time.
Well, it's so interesting because obviously it's become an incredibly funny callback within the film, his constant resistance to being known, to being seen, to being profiled, and he finds all different ways at it. And at one point, maybe it was like the 5th time that he was like, and I came to Hollywood. And my husband leaned over and he was like, poor Matt. And the thing is that you've turned it into something that feels very funny and alive in the film, but it's also clear that, this film is a condensation of many days of work, of you having to, you were not aware that Paul was dying, so certain aspects of his behavior that may have been opaque probably became clearer to you afterwards, but as you were going through the experience of interviewing him, how do you approach engaging with someone who has such a slippery way of engaging back?
I mean, it's amazing, and it's just awesome to deal with somebody who's so resistant. And there was a competitive dynamic in our interview. I remember I said to Paul, first of all, Paul's recall of his childhood was one of the most extraordinary things I've ever seen. He could talk literally for an hour about his childhood bedroom and all the textiles and colors in it. And that was clearly an engine of his creativity. So I knew we had to create an epic situation and space for him to do this interview. And I remember saying to him, you know, I've done a lot of these, like, you know, people expire around 5 hours, like that's their bandwidth. And he said, I'm not gonna get tired, you're gonna get tired. And I said, well, actually I could go literally forever. And then, so it was like game on from the moment the interview started, and then, you know, I do like hardcore prep, blah, blah, blah. And then I was going about my business trying to walk through the story of his life, and immediately it was this rebellious, slippery situation in which he was just highly resistant to any leading that I was doing. And I remember being like, this is gonna take like years to get through this interview. And I said to Emma, came up to me and was like, this is great. And I was like, this is great. Like, you know, we haven't talked about anything. And then in that moment, I recognized, okay, this is who Paul is. He may be at times combative with me on camera, which you'll see more of in episode 2, but he's struggling within himself to figure out how to speak as himself. And we tried to film Paul out in the world in, you know, verite, but it didn't work. He was a little too controlling and uncomfortable doing that. And I realized that this was verite, and my editor, Damian Rodriguez, and I said in the edit room, this is interview verite. Let's thread this through the film. And, you know, I was pretty reticent to put myself in the film. I've never done that before.
You do have some of the best lines, and in the second part, which I've been lucky enough to see, he lands some real singers. In a challenging match, he really lands some singers.
Yeah, I just realized that I needed to be in there, and Paul and I, early on, discussed that our dynamic was interesting, and one of the strategies I used in the interview process when he would, you know, be talking about lollipops or pretzels for 30 minutes, I would bring it back to our relationship, and that became generative, and it became a way for us to kind of create some heat and energy within the interview. I mean, this was a 40-hour interview. It was really epic.
Well, it's really interesting. Queerness has been a subject in almost all of your work, whether it's on the surface or whether it's a story that travels beneath it. And through your work, you've been able to tell a queer story over a long period of time. And what was interesting is that with Paul, you found someone who had been oppressing the queer story for a long time. There were moments when you were telling me about the dynamic where I thought, like, he must in some way be so, like, amazed, confused, at times jealous that somebody's able to make this a part of their life and succeed. And that's just, not to pop psychologize someone who's clearly so complicated, but I'm curious what it was like for you to try to tackle that subject with him for the first time on screen, and, you know, how much of that you discussed beforehand, how much of that you felt his pushback to, and how much you felt like he was finally ready to go there.
Yeah, I mean, me being gay and Paul being gay was a point of affinity and tension. We're of different generational experiences. I've made a lot of historical films, I get it. But that tension about identity was very real between us. Yet, Paul was very clear from the beginning that he wanted to come out in the film, and I knew that as a younger person, I could help him do that on his own terms. And I chose to interview Paul chronologically through his life so he would have a sense of when the more sensitive or difficult things were coming in the trajectory of the interview. And the day that Paul, you know, obviously I knew the story of his relationship with Guy. I found it to be fundamental to kind of some of the decisions he made artistically and also personally, and the kind of sacrifices at play for him to accomplish the work that we love. So, you know, I saw that as, in some regards, being the nucleus of the film in this section. And, you know, when we approached it, Paul was very, very anxious and squirmy, and we stepped aside, and I said, all you gotta do is say I'm gay. And he was like, okay. And then we did it, and Paul, just deep, soulful, intensely sensitive, emotional person. it's a huge range of feelings, and when he goes there, he was so soulful, and I was so proud of him. It was an incredible experience to go through that with him because, you know, I knew Paul so well by the time we were doing this interview. We had spent hundreds of hours speaking to each other, but I didn't fully get that he hadn't told people, real people in his life, he hadn't said I was gay. I think of that generation, the idea is that it's just assumed. So we went through a journey regarding that topic in the film. It was a huge point of sensitivity.
And I remember the day that you finally shot that material and you telling me, like, I just had one of the most life-changing professional days of my life, just being in the room with him.
Not professional, personal. It was one of the most intense experiences I've had with another. I mean, the whole film has been the most intense experience I've ever had with another human being. Watch part 2. But, you know, that was a product of our relationship. It's like with documentaries, I think you think that the filmmaker is just observing somebody. These are two-way relationships. Things happen within them. And you were asking about fandom. It's like, I develop a relationship with the people living or deceased who have transformed me, and I pursue relationships with them. And Paul and I had a complex and generative relationship.
And a very full relationship. He was in your life for a shockingly brief time, considering what we know will come out of it and what has come out of it already. And since there are a lot of undercurrents that flow through this first section, obviously we've talked about sort of queerness, which comes in and goes. This footage with Guy is so beautiful because it's the time that he feels the most human, and it's the time he feels the most connected. And I think by seeing it, it creates this kind of like well of empathy for him as we take the rest of the journey. But one theme that came out for me a lot on this viewing was his obsession with fame and his obsession with success. And what I'm so impressed is you were able to capture that quality in him without making it seem craven or repulsive, which it might on another person. And I wondered if you had any insight into sort of how that desire, where it formed in him, and also how it both aided and injured his life.
Yeah, I mean, the Spanky Alfalfa dichotomy I loved that analogy that he made. I tried to keep threading it and it didn't work. But, you know, he was unabashedly ambitious and not shy about it, and I appreciated that about him. People feign modesty too much. And anybody who accomplished what he did artistically to basically be an avant-garde performance artist in mainstream pop culture is ambitious. That doesn't happen by accident. That is an unprecedented thing that happened by design. And that was part of what I admired about Paul. But of course, there is like a kind of Faustian thing at play. He sacrificed himself to be able to enhance this alter ego to be believable as a real person. And so, yeah, I think like the toll of him entertaining and delighting us or transforming someone like myself as a child, particularly with Pee-wee's Playhouse, was huge on him personally. That was my sense, getting to know him and talking to him about his work.
We all have different relationships with people we know, with people we love, when they're living and when they're dead. Our relationships transform. But you had the very unusual experience of working with Paul as he was dying without knowing that that's what was happening, and then having to finish a film in which there had been an enormous amount of conversation about what he wanted it to accomplish, and you letting him know that you also had to put your imprimatur on it, and those two things had to live together. You then had to rethink all of that after Paul's death. And so, how as a filmmaker do you think about that kind of challenge, and how did you tackle it?
You separate yourself from the material as much as possible. And I brought in all sorts of collaborators alongside Damien, our principal editor. I brought in people like David Teague and Lance Edmond, other editors who I'd worked with on previous films. I usually don't show my friends rough cuts. I showed them because I was too emotionally rattled by the experience of making the film and the loss of Paul, which was something I'm still wrapping my head around. It's so surreal that I brought in other people into my process to help me see Paul both clearly and within his full complexity. You know, I would often say to Paul, you know, don't be simple. Being simple is beneath you. Everyone on earth kind of is going to expect that you're complicated. Like, embrace your complexity. And I think when I started to edit the film, I was a little rose tinted. I was veering towards the hero worship, which I said is not my thing. But through the kind of perspective and insight of the people around me, I recognized that I had to take my own advice and to embrace Paul in his full complexity in order to do what we both wanted to do, which is to create, as I pitched originally to him, a compelling portrait of an artist.
You had to have perspective.
Good one.
The word that, as he was trying to remember it, I was like, what is the word? Who would know that word? You obviously went through an enormous amount. Archival material is always a huge part of your work. You always form incredible bonds with your archival editors, with your archivists. You always got an archivist on the line, I don't even know what to say. But you had to go through so much material in order to understand Paul's life. And some of it was physical material too, actually going through the intense amount of possessions that he'd accumulated, his obsession with decorating. So it wasn't just going over footage and sourcing footage, it was also figuring out all of the kind of, when we see that shot of his first, you know, Pee-wee's Playhouse, the office he rented in LA, much of that stuff was still in his archives. How did you approach that, and how did you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, so much credit is due to Lena Dunham, unrelated, who
Maybe related.
Co-producer of the film, who hand digitized all of Paul's videotapes. We had 1,000 hours of archival footage and tens of thousands of photos, and Paul, most of it is Paul's. He stored the tapes in his temperature-controlled bedroom. Paul was an archivist, you know, and so am I. So that was a point of connection, and Britton went through every tape with him and watched all those thousands of hours. And I worked with a big team, and you know, we really mined the material. There was a time where I wanted to thread more of Paul's tenderness in the film, and part of what you'll learn more in episode 2 about is his relationship to nature. And I said to the team, like, let's, you know, Vanessa Martino, our associate editor, let's find every shot of Paul with an animal you can find. You know, so we came to really know this material, but Paul's collecting is a big part of the second episode that you will see. He had enormous, fascinating collections unrelated to Pee Wee Herman that were part of his creative imagination. I would say collecting and childhood were two of the biggest engines. And we ventured to create a museum of his life that we were able to film in certain ways that you'll see. But you know, I keep stumbling upon subjects with monumental archives, and it speaks more about the subjects than about the coincidence.
It speaks to the kind of people that interest you, are people who themselves are reporters. One of my favorite parts of episode 1 is seeing the creative community that springs up around Paul in Los Angeles, what he has at CalArts, then what he finds in the Groundlings. But then there's that bittersweet quality, which is that, like, sort of every Eden like that gets interrupted by everybody going on about their lives, whether it is that they go on to SNL, or as Paul did, like, meet this very unusual kind of success, or as some of them did, not stay in this world and fade away, have very different kinds of stories. And I'm curious, you got to speak to a lot of those people, and considering Paul was such a complex, thorny, but ultimately loving person, how did you feel that what did you feel that their perspective on him was towards the end?
I mean, it's hard to summarize. Everybody was different, but I think there is a sort of romance to your first early work. I know that's true of you, it's true of me, you don't...
I still feel romantic because we met in our 20s.
It's not about us. But it's, you know, you don't have expectations. You are not self-censoring. It's just it's an incredible thing as a creative person when you make your first thing, because you don't know what you're doing, and it's very pure, and the Pee Wee Herman show was that. And also,
I don't even know that there's a wrong way to do it.
no, and there's no blueprint, there's no model, and particularly in the late 1970s in Los Angeles, this kind of underground punk meets art meets comedy thing was not like something people aspired to. It was a percolating cultural moment that was off the radar, that was word of mouth. And for something to become a cultural phenomenon out of that is singular, but it did because there was a purity of vision to it. And really interesting, talented people like Gary Panter and Lynn Stewart and Phil Hartman and John Moody, just these really interesting but really different people kind of like colliding. And just like I tried to show all the cultural references that collided into Pee-wee, I wanted to show all the different people at that moment in Los Angeles that could generate something that in that time would go viral, you know?
Like in some way, Pee-wee was an amalgamation of all these talents and all these ideas and all these
100%, yeah. And I think that is the spirit of improvisation. We think of improv as a stepping stone for mainstream comedians now, but I think improv wasn't about, you know, coming up with something funny. It was about figuring out how to move together and make together in a way that felt very unique at that moment in the groundlings.
Yeah. Well, I hope you will all tune in. I know you will all tune in to watch episode 2. Just like put on episode 1